Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside, and realizing the sun no longer shines the way it used to. It's there in the sky, yes, but dim, pale, and ghostly. Instead of golden rays bringing warmth, it looks more like a dull, sickly moon instead of a bright, vibrant sun. This is not science fiction. This is exactly what people across the world described in the year 536 AD. Eyewitnesses from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all recorded the same terrifying truth. For more than a year, the sun lost its brilliance. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year. In Ireland, chroniclers noted a failure of bread from the years 536-539, meaning crops simply would not grow. And in China, records describe strange yellow skies, frost in midsummer, and widespread famine. Think about the shock this must have caused. Ancient people depended on seasonal rhythms for survival. Farmers knew when to plant, when to harvest, when to store food for the winter. But suddenly, the world's calendar was broken. Summers were cold and gray. Fields refused to ripen. Even in places that normally had fertile soil, crops withered before they could be harvested. The result was immediate: hunger. When crops failed, communities starved. Families who relied on their fields faced shortages of grain, vegetables, and fruit. In many regions, famine spread quickly, and with famine came disease. Malnourished bodies grew weak, unable to fight off even simple illnesses. Some historians believe this strange dimming of the sun may have also contributed to the outbreak of what later became known as the Plague of Justinian, a deadly pandemic that swept through the Byzantine Empire less than a decade later, killing millions. While the exact connection is debated, one thing is clear. The year without light left people vulnerable in ways they had never been before. Imagine being a farmer in 6th century Europe, standing in a field of empty stalks while your children cry from hunger. Imagine being a merchant in the Middle East, watching trade routes collapse because no one had surplus grain to sell. Imagine being a scholar in China, looking up at a yellow, dim sky and wondering if the heavens had turned against humanity. The psychological toll must have been enormous. To people who had no scientific explanation for volcanic ash or atmospheric changes, the darkened sun must have felt like an omen, perhaps divine punishment or the sign of an approaching apocalypse. For more than a year, the world lived under that eerie shadow. The year without light wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a global event that reshaped economies, weakened empires, and planted seeds of fear that would linger for generations. And yet for centuries, it was almost forgotten, tucked away in scattered chronicles, waiting for modern science to uncover the clues. When we think about the great catastrophes of history, certain events usually come to mind. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii, the Black Death that swept through medieval Europe, or the fall of Rome. But the year 536 AD, often called the worst year to be alive, barely appears in most history books. Why? The answer is that this catastrophe was so widespread, so global, and so poorly understood that it slipped through the cracks of collective memory. There was no single empire to claim it, no single city to mark its destruction. Instead, it was a silent disaster that stretched across continents, leaving behind fragments of testimony and scattered chronicles. In the Byzantine Empire, the historian Procopius recorded the eerie dimming of the sun, but he was not the only one. In Syria, Michael the Syrian later preserved accounts of strange weather that decimated harvests. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster describe years of famine beginning in 536. And in China, official court records speak of yellow dust falling like snow, mysterious fogs, and summer frosts that killed crops before they could mature. These accounts weren't linked together until modern times. For centuries, they were treated as local misfortunes, not evidence of a global catastrophe. Villages remembered their own famines. Families passed down memories of hunger. But the idea that the entire world had been plunged into darkness? That was lost. It is only in recent decades that scientists and historians began to piece the puzzle together. Tree ring evidence from Scandinavia showed an unprecedented lack of growth starting in 536, lasting for more than a decade. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica revealed layers of volcanic ash that matched the same period. Suddenly, all those old stories, the dim sun, the bitter cold, the famine, lined up with physical evidence buried in the earth itself. So why was it forgotten? Partly because people in the 6th century had no framework to understand what was happening. Without modern science, they interpreted the event through the lenses of religion, myth, and superstition. In some regions, the darkened skies were seen as punishment from the gods. In others, they were taken as signs of an approaching apocalypse. Each community told its own story, but no one realized they were part of the same shared crisis. And partly, it was forgotten because the world was already in turmoil. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed just decades earlier. Wars raged across Europe and the Near East. Kingdoms rose and fell so quickly that the dimming sun became one more hardship in an age already defined by instability. Yet the consequences of this forgotten catastrophe were profound. Famines in Europe weakened populations, leaving them vulnerable to later plagues. Crop failures in Asia disrupted dynasties and destabilized economies. And in the Middle East, weakened trade routes reshaped political alliances. This was not just a bad year. It was the beginning of a chain reaction that reshaped civilizations. Today, as scientists look back, 536 AD stands as a turning point. A catastrophe that nearly vanished from memory, hidden in scattered accounts across continents. But when we connect the dots, we see a sobering truth. For more than a year, humanity lived under a shadow, united by suffering and largely forgotten by time. For centuries, the strange events of 536 AD were treated as unsolved riddles, whispers of famine, rumors of a dimmed sun, fragments of memory passed down through scattered chronicles. But in the modern age, science has given us new tools to revisit this mystery, and what those tools revealed is astonishing. The breakthrough came not from dusty manuscripts, but from nature itself. In the 1990s, scientists studying ancient tree rings noticed something unusual. Across Europe and even as far away as Mongolia, trees showed stunted growth starting in the year 536. For entire decades, their rings were narrow, proof that the climate had shifted dramatically. At the same time, glaciologists drilling deep into the ice of Greenland and Antarctica uncovered another clue. Buried within the frozen layers were microscopic shards of volcanic glass, evidence of a colossal eruption that had hurled ash into the stratosphere. These layers matched perfectly with the timeline of 536. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. The year without light wasn't the work of angry gods or cosmic curses. It was nature itself, unleashing one of the most powerful volcanic eruptions in recorded history. But here's where the mystery deepens. Which volcano was responsible? For years, scholars debated. Some pointed to eruptions in Central America, others to Indonesia. Today, the leading theory suggests that a massive eruption in Iceland blanketed the northern hemisphere in volcanic ash and sulfate aerosols. These particles scattered sunlight, dimming the skies and cooling the Earth's surface by several degrees. Think about the scale of this. A single eruption, powerful enough to change the color of the sky across continents, to lower global temperatures, and to push entire civilizations into crisis. And as if that weren't enough, the evidence shows there wasn't just one eruption. Additional volcanic events in 540 and 547 AD prolonged the chaos, extending the cooling and keeping humanity trapped in hardship for more than a decade. To put this into perspective, modern volcanic eruptions like Mount Pinatubo in 1991 cooled the planet by about half a degree Celsius for a year or two. But the 6th century eruptions were far stronger, pushing the northern hemisphere into what some scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age. This sudden cooling reshaped weather patterns, destroyed harvests, and rippled through societies for generations. And yet, even with all this evidence, the story remains partly unsolved. The exact volcano responsible for the first great eruption of 536 has never been definitively identified. The Earth keeps her secrets well. But the fingerprints are everywhere, in the stunted trees, the poisoned ice, and the frightened words of those who witnessed the dimmed sun. What makes this revelation so haunting is not just the scale of destruction, but also its reminder of how fragile human life is in the face of natural forces. Entire empires, economies, and cultures can be shaken by a single eruption, hidden beneath layers of ice and forgotten in history books until science rediscovers the truth. The year 536 is no longer a mystery. It was a natural disaster on a planetary scale. And yet, the story doesn't end with ash and darkness. Because what happened after, the ripple effects on human societies, would prove just as catastrophic. The darkness of 536 did not stop with a dimmed sun and failed crops. Its consequences rippled outward for decades, reshaping economies, politics, and even the stories people told about their world. In Northern Europe, the climate shock triggered what archaeologists call the Fimbulwinter years, echoes of the apocalyptic winter described in Norse mythology. Scandinavian sagas speak of 3 endless winters before the end of the gods, and some researchers believe these tales may have their roots in the real hardships of the mid-6th century. Archaeological digs in Sweden reveal entire settlements abandoned around this time, suggesting people were forced to migrate or consolidate when farming became impossible. Further south in the Mediterranean world, the Byzantine Empire found itself stretched thin. Emperor Justinian had ambitions to restore Rome's former glory, waging wars in Italy and North Africa. But the poor harvests of the 530s and 540s drained his treasury, raised the price of grain, and strained supply lines needed to feed armies. Not long after, the empire was devastated by the Justinianic plague, which some historians argue spread faster through populations already weakened by malnutrition. The Middle East saw its own unraveling. Archaeological evidence from once thriving towns in the Negev desert shows a sudden decline in trade and urban life. Marketplaces that had bustled with imported goods went quiet. The caravan routes that carried spices, textiles, and incense slowed to a crawl. What we see is a global economy beginning to fracture, with shortages radiating out from one continent to another. Across Asia, ripple effects were just as dramatic. Chinese chronicles describe summer frosts and crop failures, but they also record waves of migration as communities sought more fertile land. Dynasties weakened as the states struggled to manage famine relief. Political instability grew, leaving the region more vulnerable to shifts in power in the decades that followed. Even the Americas may not have been spared. Ice core samples suggest volcanic aerosols circled the globe, and studies of Andean glaciers show cooling that may have disrupted agriculture in pre-Columbian South America. While written records from the Americas are scarce for this period, evidence hints that the reach of 536 was planetary, not just regional. And then there's the cultural impact. In many societies, mythology and religion absorbed the trauma of the age. From Norse legends of endless winter, to Christian apocalyptic writings that gained traction during this era, to Chinese omens describing the sun as being veiled, people translated catastrophe into stories that made sense of their suffering. These myths and prophecies endured long after the skies cleared, reminders of a time when the world itself seemed to falter. The ripple effects of 536 show us something crucial. A single natural disaster can do far more than darken the skies. It can topple economies, redirect migrations, strain political systems, and shape the very myths people use to understand their existence. In short, the shadow of 536 stretched far beyond the horizon. It cast itself into the foundations of history, and that raises a question for us today. If a chain of eruptions could tip the climate once, what would a similar shock do to our hyper-connected world? In the next section, we'll look at the lessons from 536 and what they reveal about resilience, risk, and how civilizations bend rather than break. The year 536 was more than just a dark chapter in history. It was a warning written in ash, ice, and human struggle. And though 15 centuries separate us from that time, the lessons it holds are as urgent as ever. First, nature can humble even the most powerful societies. In the mid-6th century, empires stretched across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The Byzantine Empire commanded vast trade networks. The Sasanian Persians were formidable rivals. Dynasties in China oversaw sophisticated economies and armies. Yet when the sun dimmed, when harvests failed, when the earth cooled, no crown or army could restore order to the skies. Civilizations learned the hard way that their fortunes were tied to forces beyond their control. Second, resilience is collective, not individual. In 536, no village survived by isolation alone. Communities endured by sharing what little food remained, by adapting together, and by seeking meaning in rituals, faith, and solidarity. Even the sacrifices of gold found in Scandinavia suggest a shared attempt to confront chaos, not as individuals, but as societies bound by common fear and common hope. Survival was never a solitary act. It was collective resilience. Third, disasters rarely travel alone. The volcanic eruptions of 536 did not act in isolation. They weakened crops, which weakened bodies, which left populations vulnerable to plague. Climate stress collided with pandemics and political instability, magnifying the scale of suffering. History reminds us that crises are rarely single events. They stack, they compound, and they expose every weak point in the systems we rely on. And finally, memory matters. For centuries, 536 was nearly forgotten, tucked away in scattered chronicles and misunderstood accounts. Only through science, archaeology, and the weaving together of global records did the truth emerge. The lesson is simple. If we fail to remember the fragility of our past, we are less prepared for the fragility of our future. So what does this mean for us today? We live in a world more connected than ever. Our food supply chains span continents, our energy grids cross borders, our climate system is finely balanced. A volcanic eruption on the scale of 536 would ripple through global trade, food security, and geopolitics within weeks, not years. The question is not whether nature will test us again, but whether we are ready when it does. The takeaway is clear. Resilience must be built now, before disaster arrives. That means investing in sustainable agriculture that can withstand shocks. It means supporting science so we can read the signals of Earth's past and anticipate the future. It means strengthening communities because, as the people of 536 knew, no one survives a dark year alone. The people of 536 looked up at a pale, dimmed sun and feared the end of the world. It wasn't the end, but it was a reckoning. And in their struggle lies a message for us. Civilizations don't collapse from darkness alone. They collapse when they forget to prepare for it. So, as you turn off this video and step back into the light of today, remember this. History doesn't just tell us where we've been. It warns us of where we could go, unless we learn the lessons written in its shadows. If this story intrigued you, share it. Let others know about the year the sun disappeared. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge the way we see the past and the future.